I'm excited to have here none other than a Hall of Famer, two-division world champion, Captain America, the natural. We get into it in a little bit, the protector of the sport of MMA, the one, the only, Mr. Randy Cottour. And on a personal level, it's an honor and a privilege to have this interview with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If I'm not mistaken, it's your first time in Israel?
That's correct.
How is it so far here?
It's been great. Yeah, fantastic. Beautiful setting right here on the Mediterranean, Tel Aviv, and food's been great. The people have been fantastic.
Your story begins like a lot of wrestlers that are stopping competing in your case in the Olympics or in college, and they are trying to find themselves. Can you talk about the period when you got the first call to be as an alter in UFC 13, and what made the decision moving from, let's call it, a noble sport like wrestling, Olympian wrestler, to cage fighting?
Well, I mean, the sport was obviously quite a bit different back then. It was considered an extreme sport or a fringe sport, whatever you want to call it. They didn't, they had guys like Tank Abbott running around, touting himself off a bar stool into the cage, and it was, I think in some ways they needed some legitimate athletes, guys that came from a legitimate sports background. They had guys like Mark Coleman, Don Fry, who were guys that I knew from the wrestling world that were competing and doing very, very well. And
Severn.
No holds barred back then. So that got my attention. Those were guys I competed against and trained with. Saw the direct application of years and years and years of wrestling training and expertise in the sport of mixed martial arts, and it was a chance for me basically to be a professional athlete, which I think in today's society is a pretty big deal. It also allowed me to leave my full-time coaching job and pursue training full-time. I was still trying to make the Olympic team in 2000. So that allowed me to be on the mat every single day and still take care of my family, still pay my bills, and take care of the responsibilities that I had. So it worked, and I got in on a whim. Luckily, kind of fortunately, they had an opening in the tournament back then in 1997, and the rest was history.
We see today that most of the champions in most of the weight divisions are wrestlers like yourself. Can you elaborate a little bit what makes a wrestler different from other fighter, and why we see the tendency of the wrestlers becoming champions?
Wrestling is one of the oldest combative sports on this planet. And it breeds a very particular character and a very particular mentality. You show me another martial art or another sport where every single day in the training environment I'm going 100% live against some of my best friends, but every day. That's not the case in most other martial arts. So I think it breeds an intensity, it brings a physicality. There's a particular mindset and mentality that come with the sport of wrestling that translates very, very well to combative sports like MMA.
To stay on the subject of mental state and the way you bring yourself to a fight, you served in the army. Most of our fighters in Israel and some of American fighters served too. Like we take Chaim Gozali, we take Noah Dlat, Brian Stan, Tim Kennedy, yourself. Does it help? Because we can see a difference between a fighter that served in the army and the fighter that didn't. Something is different there. Can you point at what?
I think certainly for me, the 6 years that I spent in the U.S. Army was a very formative time for me. I was 19 years old. I stayed until I was 25. I think that commitment, that discipline, that attention to detail that you learn through being indoctrinated into the military translates, again, very well to combative sports. I think it formed me as a man, as a human, in a particular way, and all of that translates to combatives, to walking up into that cage, to facing that opponent and figuring out how to solve that problem. That guy across the cage from you poses a very particular set of problems, and you've got to sort that out and figure out how to solve that problem. And the same thing is true in a military setting. You train diligently and try to anticipate your opponent wherever they may be coming from and solve the problem. Now the difference is, in the military, a lot of times you're talking about life and death. The stakes are a little higher. It's a little bit more intense because of that. This is a sport, and but you know, so you take that pressure off, you step back, and you can kind of relish in it. You can enjoy it. You can savor that engagement, and go out and enjoy the fight.
Yeah, I want to bring you back to 2010. Before even Conor and Floyd and all that noise, champion boxer by the name of James Toney is talking smack a little bit about our sport. And you came back from retirement and you said, I want to fight that guy. It should be me. Did you feel any commitment to the sport itself, to the athletes, that you said to yourself, I want to be that guy to beat him?
Well, there's been kind of that question since I started the sport in the early days. Obviously, boxing's been around for 100 years and is a very popular sport around the globe. What used to be the toughest man in the world was the heavyweight champion in boxing for a long, long time. And I don't know if that's the case anymore, but there's always been that comparison between mixed martial arts and boxers. What do they get paid? What do we get paid? How would you do against a guy like that? Oh, that guy would knock you out. You know, all these kinds of questions came up, and it was kind of the age-old question that started MMA in the first place. Well, what would happen if it was a karate guy? What about the judo guy? And obviously, Royce and the Gracie family brought jiu-jitsu to the table, and there were all these questions about styles and whose style was the best, and boxing was certainly included in that dialogue. We had a few boxers that talked about our striking and talked about how bad it was, and I don't think they understand what it's like when somebody can kick you, can elbow you, can hang on to you and attach themselves to you and fight. When there's takedowns, your boxing, your stance, all those things, they change. You have to adapt and be prepared for a lot of other things other than just somebody punching you in the head. Yeah. So, you know, I think it was, in a lot of ways, it was comparing apples and oranges, but nobody had really stepped up and put it on the line.
He never saw that sweet ankle pick.
No, yeah, you know, and again, analyzing him, taking him seriously. He's a very, very good boxer. His shoulder roll left hook is as good as anybody's. He's a 6-time world champion. So I, as a mixed martial artist, had to take that very, very seriously. And I think that's one of the reasons why I got the call and I got the chance to compete against him, because they understand or understood how I approached the sport, that I was going to think about this and I was going to try and figure this out, and what would he bring to the table. How could he catch me? He knew I was going to try and get my hands on him and make him wrestle me, make him grapple with me. So what would he try to do? How is he going to try to mitigate that? His options were pretty limited. He could time a knee or time an uppercut if he knew I was going to shoot in. So I decided to dust off an old technique from college wrestling at Oklahoma State, and that was a low single. And I had some questions about whether it was going to work and whether it was a good idea. Certainly the better grapplers that I tried it against, they knew how to defend it. If I went with any of the more pure striking guys, kickboxers and boxers, it worked every time. So then he walked out with the ankle supports on, which again, it's about friction. It's about being able to hang on to that foot and grip it. And so, you know, I was 99% sure it was going to be an effective tactic and technique, and it worked. So, but again, I took him seriously. I wasn't out to prove anything. I wasn't going to try and stand around in front of him and see how good his boxing was. I knew how good his boxing was. So the idea was to see how good his MMA was.
Yeah. And we knew the outcome, and we still watch it, and we still celebrated it. Today there are many fighters who want to conquer different weight classes. You were, if not the first, one of the first to do it. You started at heavyweight, moved down to light heavyweight, became champion in both categories. How tough is mentally and physically to do that, to cut weight, to gain weight, and why risk it? If you are a champion in heavyweight, why risk it moving down a weight class and get maybe beat up by a faster guy, or move up a weight class and get beat up by a heavier, stronger guy?
Yeah, well, it was a little bit different thought process for me because I'd wrestled most of my international wrestling career at 198 pounds. So I was cutting to make 198, 90 kilos. Yeah. And then after the 96 Olympics, they changed the weight classes. They combined 100 kilos and 90 kilos into 97 kilos, and it made the new weight class was 97, 213.75 pounds. So I kind of had to lift heavier and kind of get a little bigger. I was also aging. I was pushing into my late 20s, early 30s at that time. So it was a natural fit for me. I wasn't a big heavyweight, but I didn't really want to cut a bunch of weight and get down to 205 when I was still trying to make the Olympic team at 213. And I just, again, on a whim, got into mixed martial arts into that first UFC 13, and so I just fought at heavyweight. That was the first time there was a lightweight division, what they called lightweight back then, which was under 200 pounds. So heavyweight was a good fit. I was a small heavyweight, but I, technically was smart enough to figure out how to deal with the bigger guys. So it made sense. And then fast forward through 4, 5, 6 years in my career, I lost a couple fights. The fighters in the heavyweight division were getting more technical. They weren't just big guys anymore. They were actually skilled fighters. They were technical, tactical, good fighters, which made solving that problem a little more difficult. I run into a guy like Josh Barnett, Rico Rodriguez. I'd suffered 2 losses in the heavyweight division. Aging, pushing 40 years old at that time. They approached me about moving down to 205. I was like, yeah, I can make 205 easily. I'm walking around at 220. It's not a huge cut. They, obviously were having issues with Tito and Chuck at the time, and all that stuff was going on in the background, and they asked me to come down to 205 and fight Chuck, and I was like, sure, makes sense. I was happy to kind of go down, fight some guys that were my size, and it worked out.
A couple of quick questions. A fight that didn't happen, that you're telling yourself it should have happened?
Well, I mean, there's no secret there. I spent a lot of time and energy and money trying to make the Fedor fight happen. Most rankings had him as the #1 fighter in the world. He was fighting for Pride and signed an exclusive contract with Pride. I'm in an exclusive contract with the UFC and in the heavyweight champion in the UFC. In my mind, that's the fight that needs to happen. I mean, I'm in this to be the best at it. If I want to be ranked #1 in the world, I need to fight that guy. So spent a lot of time and energy trying to find a way to make that fight happen, and it never happened. Just for a whole bunch of reasons, but it's just one that never came together. And by the time we were both in a position to see it maybe happen, I was headed towards retiring, and he, he started losing. He'd lost a couple fights. He kind of fell off that #1 pedestal.
Even Chael said it back then when he fought Fedor, that it's supposed to be you fighting him. They say that there are no former fighters, no ex-fighters. You did it before. Is there any fight that can bring you back in the cage?
At this point, it just doesn't make sense. I still think once you're a fighter, you're always a wrestler, honestly. I think I started wrestling at 10 years old, and I will be a wrestler and approach the world looking through a wrestler's eyes my entire life. You know, and fighting is an extension of that. But you know, I've been retired now for 7 years, going on 8 years. It just, you know, certainly when Fedor threw his hat back in the ring, my phone started ringing. But it just doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm enjoying the process in acting and all the other business endeavors that I'm involved in, and focused on that. And honestly, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I got nothing else to prove. I was diligent with the money that I made when I was fighting, so you know, I'm okay, and I don't really need to go back and grind out another camp and put myself back out there.
Speaking of your acting career, you made movies with some of the biggest action stars in the world. We know like about Michael J. White that he's a real martial artist.
Mm-hmm.
Scott Adkins is a real martial
Absolutely.
artist. Who in Hollywood that we don't think about him can take care of himself outside of on the streets?
Well, you know, obviously you're referring to the Expendables cast, and Jason Statham was an Olympic caliber swimmer and an amazing martial artist at this point, but he'll be the first one to tell you he's not really a fighter. He's never really been in a real fight like that. I'm sure he's had some altercations on the street at some time in London, but
yeah.
Probably doesn't talk about that much. The only guy in that cast that was really a fighter was Dolph, and Dolph did a lot of, you know, Kyokushin karate, you know, sparring, and still competes to this day. He's a very, very good. He's a very big physical guy, and I've trained a little bit with him here and there. And he, you know, certainly in his prime, I think he would have been an interesting opponent.
Yeah. I want to quote Joe Rogan. You are the only guy that could wear a scarf and look tough, and with that scarf you can kill most of the people in the room. Fashion looks like something that's really important to you. Even back then, when everybody was wearing the tap out and the affliction shirt and those kind of noises, you were like a level above. Who in the fighting world I can go for a fashion advice, except you, of course?
I don't know. You know, fighters have their own styles, all of them. You know, they're all different. Heck, I saw a guy downstairs with a Louis Vuitton hockey mask on. So you know, you never know. The guys run the gambit. It's you know, it's about being comfortable. It's about wearing stuff that you feel good in. I never really honestly thought about it that much. I don't know where the scarf thing came from. It just started doing it, and it almost kind of, you know, between hats covering my bald ass head and scarves, it just kind of became a thing, and it wasn't a real conscious decision, to be honest.
It looks cool, really cool. You're a father to an active MMA fighter, and you corner your own son. Do you have anything like in your preparation that is different between cornering other fighters? Mentally, or maybe like even mandatory, like you're preparing yourself for your son's fight?
You know, I've been involved in this sport for over 20 years now. Never seen anybody seriously injured. You know, most of the stuff, you know, stitches come out in 9 days. The occasional broken bone, but that's a rarity. You know, I never really was concerned for his health. It was really about why. Why did he want to compete? What? You know, we went through this with wrestling, and you know, at 12 years old, he decided he wanted to jump into wrestling and wrestling full time, which is obviously the sport where I started. So, figuring out what was driving that. Was he genuinely interested and passionate about the sport? Because it's a very difficult sport. It's a tough way to make a living, honestly. And he exhibits a genuine passion for the sport. He loves it. He loves the training. He loves the learning environment. He loves putting himself out there. If anything, dragging around my last name was more of a burden and something he had to, one of those hurdles he had to get over. He had a target on his back right from the start, even as an amateur fighter. So, and he's just taken all that in stride. He's a very smart, very diligent athlete. He does the work, he has the passion for it. So both as a father and a coach, what else could you ask for? He does a great job.
You had a rich and illustrious career. You were a champion. You're a role model, even for me in Israel, watching MMA growing up. If you can change one thing in this sport to make it better or to move him forward to the masses, because like it's still, we just got New York, we just got this, but it's still not the sport of the masses. It's not Olympian sport. What one thing you would change to bring it to the masses?
I think the state of MMA right now, if I was able to change one thing, it would be to create a free and open market for the fighters. Right now it's very restricted and very anti-competitive. We talked about this with the Fedor fight. That was one of the big reasons why that fight never happened. He had an exclusive contract with Pride and was kind of controlled and signed to M1 Global, which was another organization. And I was signed to a very exclusive, rigid contract with the UFC. That's the difference between boxing and MMA. It's not a free and competitive open market where fighters, in a lot of cases, represent themselves, promote themselves. Floyd Mayweather is his own promoter. That's why he's able to rake in the kind of money from pay-per-views and fights that he does. So if there's one thing that I could change in MMA right now, it would be to create that free and open market. Why shouldn't the heavyweight champion in Bellator be able to challenge and make the fight happen with the heavyweight champion in the UFC? That would be a huge fight, very interesting fight. And those guys would potentially make a great payday, but those promoters want to protect their little fiefdom, their little kingdom, and not see that happen. So that's the one thing I think right now that's holding us back in mixed martial arts. I think they're manipulating rankings, and the guy that does the best publicity stunt is the guy that's going to get the nod. It's not based on merit. They're able to call out guys because they don't like their fighting style. They think they're too boring. Well, they're still winning fights. So who cares? As long as he's getting the job done, it's not always about just being the most exciting, most flamboyant fighter. This isn't pro wrestling. So I think that's one of the flaws in our sport right now that needs to be addressed and needs to be changed.
I'm agreeing 100%. I would like to thank you for this interview. It was an honor and a privilege to sit next to you and ask questions that personally was interesting to me, and I'm sure for a lot of fans. And it's a little bit a dream come true. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Pleasure.